In the vast and silent Sahara Desert, where the sand stretches in every direction like a golden ocean frozen mid-wave and the stars at night hang so low they seem close enough to touch, a pilot crash-landed his small plane one September morning and found himself completely and utterly alone. He had no mechanic, no town within 1,000 miles, barely enough water for 8 days, and a very serious problem with his engine. He spread his tools in the sand and looked at the damage and felt the particular, hollow loneliness of someone who is in genuine trouble and has nobody to share it with. He had known loneliness before. All his life, really. He was the sort of man who had once, at the age of 6, drawn a picture of a boa constrictor digesting an elephant, a picture that, from the outside, looked remarkably like a hat. Every grown-up he had ever shown it to had said, "What a nice hat." He had tried to explain. They had patted him on the head and advised him to take up geography or arithmetic or grammar instead of drawing. And so he had, eventually, put away his pencils and become a pilot, and spent his life among grown-ups who talked about things of consequence, bridge and golf and politics and neckties, and he had never once met one who truly understood. So there he was, alone in the desert with a broken plane and a night full of stars, when a small, clear voice spoke beside him. "If you please, draw me a sheep." He looked up. Standing in the sand, regarding him with a calm and serious expression, was a very small boy. He had golden hair that caught the first light and never quite lay flat. He wore a tiny green coat and a long striped scarf that wound twice around his neck and trailed in the sand. His eyes were the color of sky over water, light and deep at once, and they looked at the pilot as though they expected to be answered and would not be satisfied by anything less than the truth. "Draw me a sheep," the small boy said again. The pilot, who had not drawn anything since the age of 6, found a piece of paper in his pocket. He drew a sheep. The small boy shook his head. He drew another. Then another. Then, in a moment of exhausted inspiration, the pilot drew a small box with 3 holes in its side and said, "This is the box. The sheep you want is inside." The small boy's face broke into a brilliant smile. "That is exactly what I wanted," he said. "I think this sheep will be a very quiet one." And that was how the pilot met the little prince. Over the days that followed, as the pilot worked on his engine in the early mornings and they sat together through the long golden afternoons and watched the sunsets, the little prince liked sunsets enormously and could watch as many as 43 in a single day on a very small planet by simply moving his chair a little. The boy told his story. He came from a very small planet. Asteroid B612, to be precise, though the precise designation mattered less than the fact of it, a planet barely bigger than a house, with 3 tiny volcanoes, 2 active and 1 extinct, though the prince kept all 3 carefully swept out, just in case, and a single rose. The rose had arrived one day from a seed blown in from somewhere, and she had grown slowly and magnificently, with 4 thorns and a great pride in her beauty and a habit of telling small untruths to make herself seem more special than she perhaps was. She had said things like, "I am not at all afraid of tigers," when there were no tigers anywhere on the planet, and "I have always been here," when she had clearly just arrived. She asked for a glass globe to protect her at night from drafts, and then said she had not really needed it. She was vain and foolish and sometimes unkind, and the little prince had loved her very much and had not understood, at the time, how to love her properly. "I didn't know how to understand anything," he told the pilot. "I ought to have judged her by her actions and not by her words. She made my planet fragrant and lit it up. I ought never to have run away from her." But he had. He had left his small planet, tending it carefully first, sweeping the volcanoes, pulling out the baobab shoots that would, if left unchecked, split a small world open with their roots, and begun to travel among the asteroids, visiting the strange and solitary inhabitants of each one. On the first asteroid he met a king. The king sat on a throne in royal purple and ermine and ruled over everything, but there was nobody on his planet to rule except the king himself. He offered the little prince the position of Minister of Justice, to judge the old rats who were the only other inhabitants. The little prince asked if he might be excused and move on. The king, who was a sensible monarch above all else, said, "I authorize you to depart." He called it an order, so that it might appear to be his idea. On the second asteroid there lived a conceited man who wanted only to be admired. He asked the little prince to clap his hands, and when the little prince clapped, he bowed. He asked again. The little prince clapped. He bowed. It went on this way for some time. "Does admiring me ever bore you?" the little prince asked. The conceited man could not imagine the question had a meaning. On the third asteroid lived a drunkard. He sat among rows of empty bottles and full bottles and looked profoundly miserable. He drank, he explained, to forget. To forget what? To forget the shame. The shame of what? The shame of drinking. The little prince found this deeply sad and moved on without quite understanding it, and thinking about it for a long time afterward. On the fourth asteroid lived a businessman who was so busy counting stars, he was counting them so that he might own them, that he barely glanced up when the little prince arrived. He had counted up to the hundreds of millions and was still going. The little prince asked what he did with the stars once he owned them. "I administer them," the businessman said. "I count them and recount them." The little prince pointed out that he himself owned a flower, which he watered every day, and 3 volcanoes, which he swept every day, and this was of some use to the flower and the volcanoes. But owning stars, he thought, was of no use to the stars at all. On the fifth asteroid lived a lamplighter. He was the only one the little prince liked, a little. The lamplighter's orders were to light the lamp at night and put it out in the morning, but his tiny planet spun so fast now that a minute was a day and a day was a minute, and he lit and extinguished without pause, tirelessly, because those were his orders. He had no time to rest, no time to look up. He was faithful to something beyond himself, which made him less ridiculous than the others, but he was trapped by his faithfulness and could not think what to do about it. On the sixth asteroid lived a very old geographer, surrounded by enormous books of maps and records. He knew the names of mountains and rivers and deserts and oceans of 1,000 worlds. But he could not record the rose on the little prince's planet, because flowers were transient, they lasted only an instant, and geographers concerned themselves only with what was eternal. The little prince found this very upsetting. A geographer who did not value transient things seemed to have missed the entire point. The geographer suggested that the little prince visit Earth. It was said to have a good reputation. Earth was enormous. The little prince landed in the middle of a desert and talked to a snake, a small golden snake who coiled in the moonlight and spoke in riddles and said that whoever he touched was returned to the earth from which they came. "I can help you someday," the snake said, "if you grow too homesick." The little prince did not know what he meant, and moved on. He crossed mountains and called out hello, and heard only his own echo calling back. He found a garden of 5,000 roses and was devastated, because he had believed his rose to be unique in the universe, and here were 5,000 just like her. He sat down in the grass and wept. It was then that the fox appeared. The fox was a small, tawny creature with ears very slightly too large for his head and eyes the color of wheat. He sat a little distance away and watched the prince with careful, quiet attention. "Come and play with me," the little prince said. "I am so unhappy." "I cannot play with you," the fox said. "I am not tamed." "What does tamed mean?" "It means to establish ties," the fox said. "To me, you are still nothing more than a little boy who is just like 100,000 other little boys. And I have no need of you. And you, on your part, have no need of me. To you, I am nothing more than a fox like 100,000 other foxes. But if you tame me, then we shall need each other. To me, you will be unique in all the world. To you, I shall be unique in all the world." The little prince thought about his rose. "If you tame me," the fox said, "it will be as if the sun came to shine on my life. I shall know the sound of a step that will be different from all the others. Other steps send me hurrying back underground. Yours will call me, like music, out of my burrow." They spent several afternoons together. Each day the prince came at the same time, and the fox waited by the path, and the distance between them slowly, patiently, tenderly diminished. The fox explained that it was better to come at the same time every day, that way his heart would begin to feel happy in anticipation from the moment the time approached. "One must not forget," the fox said. "If you come at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, at 3 I shall begin to be happy." When the day came for the little prince to leave, the fox wept. "I shall cry," the fox agreed, "but it will have been worth it for the color of the wheat." And before the little prince left, the fox gave him a secret. It is only with the heart that one can see rightly. What is essential is invisible to the eye. The little prince went back to the garden of 5,000 roses. "You are beautiful," he told them, "but you are empty. One could not die for you. To be sure, an ordinary passerby would think that my rose looked just like you, the rose that belongs to me. But in herself alone she is more important than all of you together, since she is the one I have watered. Since she is the one I have put under the glass globe. Since she is the one I have sheltered behind the screen. Since she is the one for whom I have killed the caterpillars. Since she is the one I have listened to when she grumbled, or boasted, or even sometimes when she said nothing. Since she is my rose." He sat with the pilot through the long desert nights and told all of this in pieces, like a man unpacking something precious from tissue paper, and the pilot listened with everything he had. On the 8th day, their water ran out. They walked together through the heat looking for a well. A well in the desert seemed mad, and yet they found one, exactly as one finds things that are looked for properly, by walking until the walking itself becomes the answer. The pilot pulled up the rope and poured the cool water into a tin cup, and the little prince drank with his eyes closed and the early morning light on his face, and the pilot thought he had never seen anything so beautiful in his life. "What makes the desert beautiful," the little prince said, "is that somewhere it hides a well." The pilot fixed his engine that day. That night the little prince found the snake. He did not tell the pilot where he was going, but the pilot followed and found him sitting on an old stone wall in the starlight, talking to the small golden snake below. The pilot understood, then, what was happening. "You mustn't," the pilot said, with a tightening in his chest that he had not felt since childhood. "You mustn't go." "It's too far," the little prince said gently. "I cannot carry this body with me. It is too heavy." He looked at the pilot with his sky-colored eyes. "It will look like I have died. But it will not be true. You understand?" He smiled, a clear, full smile. "You are responsible, forever, for what you have tamed. You are responsible for your rose." In the morning, the pilot found only the place where the little prince had lain. The body was gone. He stood in the sand under the enormous sky and felt grief so clean and pure that it was almost indistinguishable from love. He looked up at the stars. When he was sad after that, he would look at the stars and remember that somewhere among them was a small planet with 3 swept volcanoes and a rose under a glass globe, being loved anyway by a small prince with golden hair who had learned, at last, how to love her properly. The stars were different to him from that day forward, because on one of them, a small boy was laughing, and that laughter was like the sound of 500 million tiny bells, and if you listened very carefully, on the right sort of night, under the right sort of sky, with the right sort of quietness in your heart, you could almost hear it. What is essential is invisible to the eye. The pilot returned to his ordinary life and began to draw again. Just small things at first: boa constrictors, sheep inside boxes, stars with tiny figures standing on them. He noticed the way children laughed with their whole bodies. He noticed sunsets, really noticed them. He understood now why the little prince had wanted to watch 43. One evening at a dinner party, where the conversation had turned to bridge and neckties and things of great consequence, a small girl, perhaps 7 years old, sitting quietly at the end of the table with a glass of juice, looked at one of his drawings and said, "Oh, is that the sheep? Is it sleeping inside the box?" The pilot stared at her. "Yes," he said, very carefully. "I think it is sleeping." She nodded with complete satisfaction and went back to her juice. He understood then what the little prince had been telling him. The capacity for this kind of seeing never truly disappeared. It went underground, like the fox, waiting for someone to tame it back to the surface. Every grown-up who had ever said, "What a nice hat," had once been a child who knew perfectly well what it was. The knowledge was still there, buried under the arithmetic and the geography and the important conversations. It only took a small prince, or a small girl at the end of a table, or a silent desert night, to call it back out. He wrote everything down. He drew the pictures himself, wobbly, sincere, full of love. He thought about the rose. He thought about how many roses there were in the world, beautiful, proud, a little vain, sometimes unkind, and how every single one of them was somebody's rose, made irreplaceable not by the rose itself, but by the watering and the sheltering and the caterpillar killing and the listening, even to the complaining. He thought about the businessman counting his stars. About the lamplighter, faithful and exhausted. About the king whose only subjects were old rats. About the conceited man, bowing and clapping in an endless circle of wanting to be seen. He thought about how much of grown-up life looked, from the outside, exactly like those small lonely planets, full of urgency and importance and productivity, and entirely, heartbreakingly missing the point. What is essential is invisible to the eye. He looked at his 500 million bells, the entire night sky, and felt the invisible thread running from his chest all the way up to a tiny planet somewhere in the dark, where a rose was putting out her 4 useless thorns and pretending she did not need her glass globe, and a small prince with untidy golden hair was sweeping his volcanoes and watching the sunset and pulling his chair very slightly around. He stepped outside under the open sky and stood for a long moment in the dark, just breathing, just looking up. Then he smiled, the kind that does not need an audience, that is lit from the inside by the most ordinary and most extraordinary treasure in any universe. Love. Imagination. The invisible, essential, irreplaceable truth of both.